have quite a bit to discuss, so I just want to kind of get a show of hands of who's had some introduction to earned value to kind of get the concepts in general. Just kind of about 50-50 it looks like. So, all right, well, that's cool. This is not going to take us into a whole lot of depth, but it will give you a good understanding about what earned value management is all about. Second question I want to ask is, can everyone catch? Everyone can catch?
Yes.
Yes, okay, everyone can catch. All right, I like to make sure people stay awake, so sometimes I'll throw a little question out there or put something out there and I'll toss a piece of candy your way. Second motivation is that, I don't like people to go to sleep on me and stuff. That's not a lot of fun. If you look like you're getting heavy eyelids, I might toss one your way for that reason as well. So everybody put the toothpicks in and make sure we're good to go. All right, great. So we're going to talk about earned value management. This is an introduction to the topic, so we'll get right into it. The objectives are to give a very high-level overview of earned value management. There are a lot of things we're not going to touch. We're going to focus mostly on, here's the mechanics, the math of it, those types of things. But earned value management is really, it's a philosophy of project management as well in my mind. So it has a lot of processes, a lot of good things that deal with change control, establishing points of authority and accountability, those types of things as well. So we're not going to talk a whole lot about that. We're just getting into the concepts of it right now. And we'll work through a couple of examples, time permitting. I was hoping to do more of them, but I don't think we're really going to have the time given the volume of the material. So we'll get right into it, and we'll get into it with a question. Oh, I'll skip past the topics there. All right, so the concept of earned value. Let's talk about that. The little clicker will work here. There we go. All right. So let me ask a question. This is interactive. Somebody will get a piece of candy for this, or multiple pieces of candy. How's this project doing? Just a thought. How's the project doing? All the people who know earned value already, don't spoil it for the people who don't. Okay. How's the project doing? Any thoughts?
Can I ask a quick question, please?
Can't really tell? Okay, someone has a question.
Is there a slide deck available for this presentation that the people from client side can listen in and, see the slide at the same time?
So I responded to a few people via email.
Okay.
These solutions are in there.
Okay.
Decided that we would post it after the presentation.
Oh, okay.
So,
You could probably go ahead and send it. It's not a huge deal, yeah.
So,
If you forwarded that email that I sent to you with the little link in there, that should work just fine. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks, I appreciate that. I'm sorry.
Ask for this review.
I'm sorry, your name is?
Georgia Mesa, last name is Anthony, A-T-E-A.
Okay.
Okay. All right, good. All right, great.
Georgia, G-I-R-I-J.
Okay. All right, so looking at this, we can see that if you look at this, the green line represents how much money we've spent, and the blue line is pretty much our plan. Here's what's the cost that we plan to spend. So looking at that line, can we really tell how the project is doing? So I'd ask a question to say, if actual costs are greater than planned costs, as shown in our example, what are 5 possible status conditions of our project which cannot be determined by simply looking at the graph? So you know that you spent more money than you intended to spend or what you thought you spent by a certain point in time, but throw out there, if you would, just a few possible statuses that this project could be in with respect to how's it doing with respect to cost, how's it doing with respect to the schedule, and how's it doing with respect to scope. Any thoughts?
Ahead of schedule? Schedule.
It could be ahead of schedule. That's true. So it's ahead of schedule, but there's also, what about cost side of it?
Don't know.
Don't know, okay. Don't know, that's correct, because we don't have history. Who said I don't know? There you go, you don't know, so you can catch it. All right, wonderful. So there's all kinds of status conditions, so if you think about it, if you back this up a little bit, depending on how much work we got done, which is kind of what the concept of earned value is all about, I could have performance that's doing great. It's above how much I spent, and it's above how much work I actually got done. Or it could be right on track, right in line with the cost. Or it could, all kinds of status conditions could be the case. So I listed 5 status conditions that I could look at that and say, here's what's going with those. So I'll go ahead and just show those. So the project is ahead of schedule, and costs are in line with the work that was accomplished, right? Or the project is ahead of schedule, and costs are less than the anticipated work that was accomplished. The project is ahead of schedule, but costs are in excess of what was planned for work accomplished. Or the project is on schedule, but costs are in excess of what was planned for the work. And the project is behind schedule, and costs are in excess of what was planned for the work. So if you kind of think about, if I were going to pick a representation of how much work actually got done, then it could have a number of different possibilities of what could be going on with this project, okay? So the main point of this is that traditional methods of measuring costs, plan versus actual, doesn't really work because it doesn't take into consideration the acceleration or deceleration of the schedule and how much work have I actually gotten done. So oftentimes if you come from a financial background like I do, we're used to tracking budget versus actuals, or we look at that for revenue and all the rest. But when you're talking about what work I've actually accomplished on the job, you really have to speak of it in terms of a third dimension. And so that third dimension, which we all know about from managing project management, is what? I'll just give a little, scope. There you go. Who said that? There you go. So you get a piece of candy there. If anybody wants to trade in their piece of candy, like they didn't like the candy, they got to see me afterwards. All right. So scope is what we have to look at. And that's really what earned value management is all about. It says, hey, we need a third piece of information in order to tell how we're doing. This clicker's giving me some trouble here. All right. So that earned value is that third piece of information. I kind of grew up with the old school, with this kind of the government terms and all those things, and they have a whole different set of terminology, and then there's the PMBOK and the terminology that goes along with that. I'll mention both. My natural gravitation is going to be toward the old school government terms. So earned value is that third piece of information. So if you were to draw those curves again, you need a third curve or a third piece of information that tells you, here's how much work I've gotten done at any point in time. The term from the PMBOK is earned value. The term that you use, that the government gives, is they use the budgeted cost for work performed. And I like that because it gives you a good idea of where it comes from. So we put together all of these budgets, and think about it if you had your work breakdown structure and you break it down into a bunch of little pieces and you schedule it and you do those things. Earned value says I give myself credit for having done a certain amount of work. So it's the budgeted cost for work performed. So when I perform that work, I give myself credit for that little morsel of work that I got done. And then you do that on an accumulated basis for many, many projects, or many, many tasks. All right?
I can be your clicker if you'd like.
Yeah, please do, because this thing's driving me nuts right here. Thank
I
you.
meant over there.
Oh, yeah, sit over there. Yeah, there you go. That probably works even better. All right, so if we go back to our previous example, this would be, we have the plan and we have the actuals. And then that third line would tell us, here's how we're doing. So under this particular scenario, what would we say? How would we do? Someone want to give me another answer? Just because you like sweets, you can say that, right? So how's the project doing? Yeah, it's doing great. It's doing great with respect to cost, and it's doing great with respect to schedule. Is that you that said that? Yeah. All right, well, you can share with a friend if you want to. All right, great. All right, next slide. All right, so let's learn some terms, just if we haven't had those terms before, all right? So the first term, so if we go back in your mind to the blue line that we were looking at, which is the what we call just the generic plan right there, okay? The term that we use for that in earned value is either plan value, to use the PMBOK terms, which you probably, if you got your PMP, you had to study for it, and you passed the test and you got that. But the other term is the budgeted cost of work scheduled. So it is all those detailed little pieces of budget. So we had a work breakdown structure, we broke it down, and we put all those together. And when you kind of put that on a graph and look at all those activities, it gives you a cost curve, if you would. And we call that the budgeted cost of work schedule. It also is the basis of our baseline that forms everything else that we do, okay? The other term that you'll see is the budget at completion. So that's really just the terminal value of that budgeted cost of work schedule. So when you get to the end of it, that's the budget at completion. Later on, we'll talk about the estimate at completion. So we'll talk about how we compare what I estimate the project to be at the end and what my initial budget was for that project at the end. The next one we already talked about, the budgeted cost for work performed. That's the earned value. That's the magic one that makes it all come together. And then the actual cost of work performed, that's just your actual cost, comes out your accounting system, come out your ERP system, and it's necessary in order to do the full analysis. Okay, now next slide. Great. Okay, so now I'm just showing you the curve again with the right terms there. So we have earned value, which is the pink line. We have ACWP, which is the green line, and then we have the BCWS, which is the blue line. All right, next slide. Okay, now the main idea is that in earned value, we don't really want to ever just compare our actual costs to our plan. That's kind of what we've been taught to do all along through our lives, and we make that comparison. But that's actually a comparison that you never make in earned value. You always compare your costs to what you actually earned. Okay, so that's a better connection. So the cost variance definition that we give is just something to remember. And the way I always remember all of these variances, that it always starts with the P. That's what I say in my mind, right? So it's the budgeted cost of work performed minus the actual cost. So when I put that into generic terms, I like to say, here's what I got done, less what it cost me to do it, right? So that's the way that you can think about it. So all those, here's the individual elements of work that I actually earned and what was the budget for those things, less the actual cost for those things. So it gives you a picture of your cost variance with respect to performance. Okay, let's go to the next one. We'll look at another variance here. All right? Then there's the schedule variance. Now this one's kind of hard sometimes for people to wrap their minds around because you're saying, hey, you know, how am I talking about schedule in terms of dollars or hours or something? That doesn't quite make sense to me. But a good way to look at it is almost like the accomplishment variance. So the way I like to look at it is what I was supposed to get done, what I got done minus what I was supposed to get done. That's the way to look at it. So I had a budgeted value for what I was supposed to get done at a certain point in time, and then there was an actual value that I earned. And so that is a measure of how well I'm doing with my schedule. Now there's different formulas and ways to actually translate that into time, but the main idea is for you to understand that I'm either ahead or behind schedule looking in aggregate. Now we'll have some warnings about that later on because there's some other things you have to factor in. But those are the two main variances in earned value. You have cost variance and you have schedule variance, okay? I forgot my little bag of candy. Okay, so we can go on to the next slide. All right. So again, we kind of talked about that already. I verbally said all those things that we talked about. So you got cost variance, you got schedule variance. Just one thing to remember, positive is always good, negative is always bad. It's always going to be the case. All right. Next slide. All right. So we've actually have an exercise already, believe it or not. Okay. So give yourself a few minutes. Maybe we'll take 5 minutes or so. I don't know if it'll take that long, really. But this is individual. I'm sorry. Everybody has a piece of paper. All people on the phone, I guess that's a little bit more difficult. But you can see it, hopefully, if you have the slide deck. And so what we have right here is the assignment is you've got some examples that are pre-populated where you can look at the current and cumulative cost and schedule variances. So sometimes we have current period variances where we're seeing whether we're up or down, but it's important to also see the cumulative variance to see where the project is. So give yourself a couple of minutes to go through that. The little hint at the bottom says here's what the cost variance equals BCWP minus ACWP, and schedule variance equals BCWP minus BCWS. Okay? Anyone missing a little answer sheet or anything? You guys in the back have one, okay? Fortunately, you don't have to look at the previous period and add the current period or anything like that because the cumulatives are already there for you. All right, since we have so much, I'll go ahead and just start. Feel free to continue along if you're still working a little bit, but I know we've got to move along. So anybody want to tell me what is the cost variance for the current period for May? What is that? Anybody want to throw that one out there?
3,000? Negative 3,000.
Negative 3,000. Who said negative 3,000? That was you, wasn't it? There we go. Got it? You ready? All right. Watch your head. I don't want to hit the dude in the head, man. That would be very bad. Okay. Uh-oh. Sorry, I messed. All right. How about the current period schedule variance for May? -5. Okay. A whole bunch of people said that. Where are you on? Who else said -5? Who else just wants the candy? Anybody want candy? Okay. Nobody wants to go to the dentist there. All right. Now, what about the? I'll just put it both together. The current period cost and schedule variance for June. What is it?
10,000.
Negative 10,000.
Oh, I'm sorry.
10,000. All right. Who said positive 10,000? A whole bunch of people, right? All right. Who just wants candy? All right, there you go. There it is. All right, good deal. All right, so then let's talk about the cumulative cost variance for May. What's that? Minus 15,000. There you go. All right. Whoops, sorry you missed it. I'll throw you another one. You got your piece of candy. Okay. All right. What about the cumulative schedule variance for May? Minus 10? Oh, you already got plenty of candy. You already get cavities if you do that. All right. You said minus 10? All right. There you go. Catch. Okay. All right. And finally, what is the cumulative cost variance for June? -5. Who said that? Who said that first? Somebody said -5. Okay, there you go. But you're like, please don't throw any more candy at me. I'm good. All right. And then what about the schedule variance? It's 0. Okay. Now here's the interesting thing about it. With earned value, if you did everything right, at the end of the day, it's always 0 at the end when you get to the end because you did all the work that you were scheduled to get done. So eventually you get there. It might be late when you do it, but eventually you do get there. Okay, I won't throw candy because I think everybody got that one. Okay, next slide. Okay, there's the answers right there. So we went through all that already. Okay, next slide again. Okay, talk a little bit about the history and applications of earned value. I'll talk very, very briefly about the history because I don't know a whole lot of the history. But let's talk about it. I do want you to have some background to it. Earned value was used on U.S. government contracts. It was really a way at a point in time when a lot of money was being spent on these programs, and there really wasn't any measurement or any justification of what was actually getting done. So kind of a famous case, and if you want to read about it, is there was a presentation that Wayne Abba did, and I was wondering if he might show up at this. I'm glad he didn't because then I'd feel really, really intimidated. But he's one of the godfathers of earned value. But there was a classic, well, there was a typo there, the A12 Avenger 2 case. He kind of goes into that. If you go onto the website for the Project Management Institute for the DC chapter here, he actually did a presentation on that in 2010, and I found that. I said, oh, that's pretty good. So it'll tell you a little bit about it and how earned value came to be. But largely just remember that programs were overrunning, and they found out at the end of the day that this thing wasn't working. And so when things blow up and they go really, really bad, they stand before Congress. They have to answer to all of these types of people. So that's kind of what was going on with that program. And that's one of the programs where earned value helped to kind of realize that, hey, this thing is in trouble. It's never going to get better. And it was terminated. So it was a pretty famous case in the earned value world. All right. Let's see. We can move on. The rest of that's not so important. The main thing to remember, there is a standard. The ANSI standard 748 is the Bible, if you will, of how to implement earned value. And if you have an earned value requirement and you have a cost type contract, so cost plus fixed fee, cost plus incentive fee, all those types, sometimes on T&M, I haven't seen that too much, but there's usually an earned value requirement. If it's $20 million, but between $20 million and $50 million, you're supposed to follow the full ANSI standard earned value, but they won't have all the compliance reviews. They won't have an integrated baseline review, all this stuff. This stuff gets really, really huge if you get deep into earned value and you have a full earned value requirement. They can, you need to have people that understand just how to get you through those processes. If it's $50 million or greater, that's when you start to really it costs a lot of money. So when you start talking about earned value, a lot of people don't want to deal with it. It costs money, doesn't add anything, yada, yada, yada. Two responses to that is that you get out of it what you put into it, and the other response is that you know, a lot of the administration, a lot of the proof that you're doing what you're supposed to do is what comes along when you get over that $50 million mark. The other thing that can happen sometimes to be careful of is sometimes because everybody wants their job, right? They want to keep it. And so what will happen is sometimes they'll throw in an earned value requirement. Either it could be under this $20 million mark, or it could be the kind of work that it doesn't really apply to. So earned value works best when there's actually something tangible, something that's being built, something that has some kind of a concreteness where you can measure actual pieces of work that is getting done. If you're just doing a labor support contract that's just, you know, you're putting, it's a terrible way to say it, but like you say, butts and seats kind of a thing, and so people are doing that, that's not really for earned value, because it doesn't really add much value. And we'll talk about earned value methods. You basically just make it somewhat useless at that point. So be aware if you have an earned value requirement, say, hey, does this really apply? And sometimes you may need to push back with your customer a little bit and say, not sure this is the best thing. Okay, next slide.
Question.
Yeah.
Those were DOD. Is there an equivalent in the civilian agency world
For
the civilian agencies?
Yeah, mostly what I've seen that they tend to follow DOD. That's what I've seen. I mean, you know, it's kind of just like with, you know, the different travel requirements and things like that, other regulations. The other agencies tend to follow what DOD has. And DCMA are usually the people who are the guardians of earned value compliance, and they will be the people oftentimes with all the other agencies as well. They have their ways of paying for it internally, but yeah. Okay, good question. Other applications of earned value, and this is kind of one of my favorite areas, and I've used earned value for many years on projects that were not necessarily something that the government mandated. Sometimes you'll see the term earned value light, where it's saying, hey, I'm not asking for all the processes, I'm not asking you to do everything, but do some of the light things that we're talking about, kind of at the level of what we've been talking about so far. So you do the mechanics, but less emphasis on all the documentation, all those things as well. I've also seen earned value light be effective on internal projects. So you have an internal research and development project maybe, where you actually want something to get something concrete out of it at a certain point in time. And the other thing is on fixed price contracts. Hopefully I won't get in trouble for saying this, but you know, I worked for Science Applications International Corporation for many, many years. And back in the early 90s, they lost tons and tons of money. I won't say how much, but it was tons of money they lost on fixed price contracts. So they actually, the auditors said, hey, you people need to go and learn how to do project management. And they took it very, very seriously and developed a whole culture around this stuff and managing fixed price contracts. And one of the things that we did is we used earned value management on our contracts internally, and that really turned them around. I mean, it really, really did, and there was a lot of reporting and rigor that went into it. Matter of fact, if anybody's interested, there's a little magazine that's down there, and it has an article about fixed price project management if anybody has fixed price contracts, and it's in the back of there. I did write it, yes, but anyway, take a look at that. All right, and so what I noted earlier is that earned value is not useful when the work is level of effort and the deliverable is providing labor or services about discrete elements of work to be accomplished. And I said that earlier, but the reason is because when you have a level of effort type task and earned value, what you earn is always equal to what was scheduled. So basically it's like, what's the point? There's no need in doing it anymore. Okay, next slide. All right, establishing and protecting the performance measurement baseline. Okay, next, we'll move on here. All right, so the performance measurement baseline is a time phase budget resulting from a network scheduling of all these activities. So in crude terms, it's that BCWS curve that we looked at before. And that curve has to be protected. So you can't just kind of arbitrarily add things, take away things, change it. There are certain rules that must be kept. And usually when you're talking about all these compliance reviews and those things, it's about making sure that you're not playing with that thing and not doing things to that performance measurement baseline that you're not supposed to be doing. Everything really rests on that. Okay, we can go to the next slide. I know that'll be mindful of the time. So here's some of the steps in defining the performance measurement baseline. So you want to define the work, right? So we start with the statement of work, and then we develop a work breakdown structure. We do all those things. And then we put that into the smallest elements that we need to. And then we schedule the work. And so by schedule, we're not talking about, hey, I'm just going to pick all the dates that I want these things to happen. There's tools like Microsoft Project, OpenPlan, a bunch of other Primavera P3. And you put all of these activities in the network, and then you build the dependencies of the work. So you estimate how long it's going to take. You apply resources to those things, and you develop a real schedule. So once you do that, you develop the logic, the network, and then you allocate those resources. And when you allocate those resources, then you schedule out, you get that budgeted cost of work schedule curve that we talked about. In order for the schedule to be realistic, you have to also balance the resources. So the little example there in the bottom is, it's not realistic if you got Fred working 300 hours a week. That's not a real schedule at that point. It's, it's a wish at that stage of the game. All right? So this is kind of a graphical picture from something that I did many moons ago. And it kind of gives you a good way of looking at this. So here's the scope of work that I had to break down. So I defined the work here. And then here's a representation of the schedule with the Gantt chart. It could be shown with a network diagram and all the rest. And then you see here's the cost curve that comes from. That's the budgeted cost of work schedule. So this was a real example from a tool that I used to use many years ago. Okay? All right, next slide. So that's our performance measurement baseline. And we talked about the budgeted cost of work schedule. And at the terminal value, what did we say the terminal value is called? What's that? Budget at completion? All right, is that what you said? Yeah, okay, good. All right, great. All right, next slide. All right, methods and pitfalls of claiming earned value credit. So we talked about earned value is about being able to take credit for all these little elements, work packages, we call them, of work. So let's go to the next slide. All right, so there's several ways to take credit. Now, so you can't avoid a certain amount of what we would call level of effort tasking that's part of a program, right? So you have people that just kind of hang out and their work is so broad in general, it's almost like overhead. They affect everything, right? So I've got a project manager, sometimes there's a systems engineering department, all these types of people. For that part of your budget, you get credit just for showing up. You show up to work, you get credit for it. Maybe there's some things that you can make a little bit more discreet, like develop project management plan, do certain things like that. But generally, those are the level of effort tasking, and it doesn't really affect your earned value analysis much one way or the other. I've seen some people even argue just don't even put that in the whole analysis. I tend to like to have it just because I like a complete answer. The other method that it gives is percent complete. So you got a $100,000 task. Let's say you can make it more realistic. You got a $500,000 task, and you basically ask the person, okay, how you doing on that? I think I'm about 25% done, right? And so then you ask them the next week, well, I think I'm about 75% done. Then you ask them the next week after that, I think I'm about 76% done. Now I think I'm about 77%, right? So that last little bit goes on. Not my favorite method because it can be gamed a whole lot. And so when people start talking about earned value, it doesn't really show you anything. It's because people are doing this a lot of times, and then they're really gaming the system. Another one that's not too bad, that's pretty good, is really the interim milestone method. Usually it's for if you have a longer task, but you want to break it into milestones such as, develop requirements, section A, and then do whatever. Break it into individual pieces, and then you give yourself credit. You have predetermined amounts that you would give yourself credit for. But the question that was sometimes begged is, why didn't you break it down into more pieces in the first place? So that's one method, but it's not a bad method, and I like it. Percent start, percent complete. That is probably what you will see a lot of. So you decompose your work, and I give myself so much credit for starting, so much credit for finishing. Now, one that you see one that you see a lot of that I'm not that crazy about, but you do see it a lot, is 50-50. I give myself 50% credit for starting, 50% credit for finishing. And the logic is, well, it took me 2 accounting periods maybe to do it, and so I'll give myself 50% the first half, 50% the second half. That's okay, but in my mind, I think that's kind of aggressive to give yourself that much credit just for starting. So I pick up my pencil, right, and I say, okay, I started, so let me give myself 50% credit. I don't like that. So the most conservative percent start, percent complete method would be to do 0-100. And that's pretty conservative. A lot of people don't like that one, but I do like it, especially when I dealt with those internal projects, when you're talking about losing money on a fixed price type program, if you're doing that for internal purposes. It's great to be very conservative, so it forces people to say, hey, look, it's black or white, guy. You got it done or you didn't get it done. No in between. So there's a lot of good stuff about that. If you look at this, in terms of the way I arranged it is that this is very subjective, the more subjective on this end of the scale, and this is more objective, and that's what I like as far as earned value, making it as objective as possible. Okay, next slide. This is kind of a visual depiction of what it would look like. to take earned value credit based on those different methodologies for the percent start, percent complete. So in this case, it's 2575. I've got a $100,000 task. So in January, I take 25,000 for it, nothing in February, and 75,000 in March. And people don't like that to some degree because it's why I look bad in February. But I think with variances, we're going to talk about variance analysis, it's more important to explain and understand why your variances are what they are than it is to look good. And so sometimes when you get in front of the government and do those types of things, everybody wants to look good. But just understand what the numbers are and be able to talk to them. I think I saw a yawn right here. I have to throw a piece of candy on the kid. All right, so the next one is 0, 100, no credit, and then you get all the 100K credit at the end of that. Okay? All right, so things to watch for in earned value when claiming credit. So earned value credit being accumulated without any cost at all. So it's kind of suspect, right? So I've gotten credit, but I haven't spent any money. What's going on with that, right? Or it could be that you didn't necessarily accrue some of your expenses. So part of what happens when we talk about the cost piece of things is that you may not have actually, just for lack of a better term, actually paid for it or created an accounts payable item for a particular cost that's due. However, it's in the pipeline. You have actually incurred that. It's kind of beyond the scope of this class, but it's looking at accrual-based accounting. So you actually have, when you incur the expense, you record it, even though you haven't necessarily passed it through your accounting systems and all that yet. Okay? Earned value credit being greater than the task budget in the first place. So if the task, it's only worth 100K, but you give yourself 150K. Most of the accounting tools that you use, or the cost engines like Cobra or tools like that from Deltek, they won't let you do that. But if you're kind of doing a homegrown version on your own, that could happen. Let's see, earned value credit not being taken for tasks shown as complete and in the past per the updated schedule. So if you kind of visualize your Gantt chart and this is time now and you've got 5 tasks that were completed, but there's no earned value credit taken for those. So what's going on? So those are questions that you have to ask along the way. Okay, next slide. All right, capturing actual cost of work performed. So let's talk about that. All right, important to have an accounting system with a project ledger, not just a general ledger. So by that I mean kind of hard to do that with QuickBooks or something like that in general, because you have to be able to record costs against individual projects with not just the project as a whole, but you've got to be able to break that down and have individual costs that you can collect against different pieces of work. Have to be able to capture costs and hours. We've talked about this in terms of dollars, but you can do earned value based on hours. And some of the analysis that we'll talk about later requires you to look at it both ways. So I have earned value in dollars and I have earned value in hours, and we get into rates and some of those things, and it gets a little bit more complicated. You do have to be able to capture costs generally by labor, ODCs, subs, and materials. And we won't want to get into the differentiation of ODCs versus materials, but I think most people get the idea. And you usually will have to be able to map your general ledger accounts into these particular buckets that are necessary to do some of your analysis. You have to be able to align your project numbers or your charge codes, whatever you call them in your accounting system, and they have to be able to be aligned to what we call control accounts. And the control accounts are these individual points of accountability that are established in the program. That's kind of just saying it really quickly, an intersection of the work breakdown structure and the organizational breakdown structure that you have for your project. So that's kind of where you have control. You have to be able to collect costs at least at that level. Usually they advocate going a level below that. Should be able to isolate billable costs from non-billable expenses. So if you have to report to the government, you're only reporting on what's billable. Whatever you choose to eat on your own internal for your company, that's on you and doesn't get reported. Must be able to upload costs to the earned value management cost engine. I mentioned like Deltek Cobra, for example. Have to be able to do that and have to have interfaces built to do those things. So the bigger it gets, it can start to become a little bit more complicated along the way. You need to have people in place to know how to do that. Okay, next slide. All right, we already talked about you have to have charge numbers. Sometimes you call them charge codes, project codes, all those things. Have to be able to collect costs within the control accounts. We mentioned that already. And a note about this with the control accounts is that capturing costs by the organizational breakdown structure may not be the same thing as the organization that you have within your company, which could be more has to do with who gets credit for revenue and credit for sales and things like that. You may have different organizational breakdowns within your project that you have to align so that you can capture costs of those. You could have functional departments, IPTs, integrated product teams, managerial responsibility by different groups of some sort. So just be aware of that. Okay? Next slide. conflicts in setting up charge number structure. So most of us in here are project people, right? So we want the charge codes, the things that we want to manage our project, and we don't want to hear anything else. However, just be aware there's a larger universe that's out there. The priorities, and I would really back this, the priorities for setting up your project codes and your accounting system really are, in my mind, is billing number one. So, and I'm speaking from the standpoint of a contractor, right? I'm not really speaking as much from the government view. But if I can't bill for it, if I can't get paid for it, you know, why have the project, right? So everybody needs to get paid, all those things. So you have to let people have that first priority. And sometimes that means that they have to structure things in the accounting system based on CLINs, SLENs, ACRONs, all those different types of things that are necessary to bill. And you kind of have to let them do that first. Second priority is there has to be revenue recognition, and there's requirements for accounting around that as well. And if you don't do that, then you can't report financially, and especially if you're a publicly traded company, you gotta be able to report to the street and do those things, okay? And then number three, it's not the least important, but it's the most flexible, is project reporting. And sometimes people wanna make their accounting structure within their accounting system look just like the work breakdown structure and do those things. That's not really necessary because almost all these tools have a mapping function, so there's an alternate way of rolling up your costs and your expenses. So just be aware of that. Okay, next slide. I think we're good. All right, a few tips for capturing the actual cost of work performed well is use proper work authorization so people know what to charge and when. That's not one of the topics that we really get into a whole lot, but basically, you gotta let people know, here's your charge code, you're supposed to charge it, here's for how long you're supposed to charge it, and it gives them the authorization. So we talk about authorizing work, you know, from the very top, from the customer, top of the corporation on down to the project manager, but you have to authorize individuals who are working under an individual control account manager, whoever, this is what they're supposed to charge and when, so you have to let people know that. Another one that I think is important to remember, if you're working with vendors, you got materials and subcontracts, all that kind of stuff coming in, make sure that your purchase orders, your purchase requisitions, and your purchase orders are structured correctly so that costs hit in the right place. So sometimes I would see costs will go into the wrong place month after month because the purchase order was wrong, and people kept receiving the wrong number month after month, and you got to do corrections and all that stuff to be able to fix it. I mentioned accrual-based accounting, so it's important to do that. Sometimes they're called estimated actuals, and there's different rules between how you have to treat things from an accounting standpoint for an accrual, and then what you might do in your project organization, which can be a little bit different, that we can kind of talk about offline if anybody wants to know a lot more about it. I would say this, audit caution point is be careful of correcting things in reports to customers that have not been processed through the accounting system, or that you haven't put some kind of a rigor behind it to document what it is that you have, because it can be very difficult when you have to defend yourself to either DCMA or DCAA, and you've done a lot of kind of monkey business off to the side to make things look the way you want them to look, and there's nothing traceable that you can deal with later on with that. Okay? All right, next slide. Okay, let's talk about variance analysis. Who needs candy? I'm just seeing a little, seeing a little bit of some little yawn here and there. You need a piece of candy? Okay, wow, that's going to be really hard. I hope I don't kill anybody here. All right, there we go. Oh man, that was really bad. My arm's terrible. Okay, candy? All right. All right, who else? All right, man, the cameraman needs candy. Man, that's going to look really strange.
Picked up another.
All right, wait, all right, so we're waiting. All right, so let's talk about these variances again. We said the cost variance is what? Right there in front of you.
Thank you.
Earned value minus actual cost, right? And then the schedule variance is what? Earned value minus plan, right? All right, great. And again, the way to always remember when I use the government side of the speak is I always say it always starts with the P. It always starts with performance, right? So there's two basic flavors that variances come in. So there's a usage variance. So to use our example, I ate more candy, right? So that's a usage variance. I ate more pieces of candy than I intended to use. But a rate variance will be a little different. It will be like, well, maybe I used half the candy, or I didn't use, or the candy cost more than I expected it to cost. That's maybe a better example. So usage variance is I used more hours than I was intended to use. I used more widgets than I was intended to use. But the rate variance would be, wow, the people that I hired, they cost more than I intended for them to cost. Or whatever it is that I'm buying. So there's rate variances and usage variances, and your variances can be best understood when you look at both of those things. Now, I don't oftentimes see that happening when I've looked at earned value programs. So people will explain their variances based just on this right here, but they haven't broken them down even further to understand the rate and usage variance. Let's go to the next slide here. All right, look at the time there. We're doing pretty good. So the other thing to look about with these variances, the current period variances are important, but the cumulative trend is much more important. Like, where is this variance going, and what is it cumulatively? So I could have bad earned value for the current period, but the next period I'm going to pick it up, or it could be from the standpoint of I had a positive variance in the previous period, and this is a negative variance this period, but cumulatively I'm right on track on where I need to be. So things can get out of sync a little bit from period to period, but you want to look at the cumulative trend to see where things are going. On a large program, you also want to think about having a variance threshold, because you can't possibly look at every little variance that comes out. So if you've got a $400 million program, you can't look at every little variance that comes up. You need to have a threshold that says, here's what we're going to look at. But also consider the level of management. The level of level of variances that I will report to the CEO, right, is a very different level than what I report to the project manager or a control account manager. So you got to think about the audience as well when you're thinking about establishing how much you explain to who and when. Because you can also introduce a lot of questions that you don't want to deal with, because, hey, it's not necessary, and you get people chasing down a rabbit hole, but you don't want to do that. Also, plotting data out visually and graphs can be helpful. There's all kinds of tools on the market that will kind of help you do that, or you can do old-fashioned Excel in some cases. All right, next slide. So qualities of effective variance analysis. It's performed at the level where change can be effective, right? So if I do it too high, that's great for reporting purposes, but I have to get it down to where the rubber meets the road, because the whole idea of variance analysis is, hey, I've got to do something about it. I've got to fix it. I've got to change it. It will consider trends. We talked about that. And then you want to look at the root cause. So when you're talking about explaining variances, we're talking about what's the root cause of it. So using an example here, I used more labor than planned is not a good explanation. Can't tell you how many times I've seen that, though. I mean, I've used more labor than planned. Well, we know that. Tell us why. Give us some more information. When you break it down and say, hey, there was an unexpected coding error in XYZ module, this is what we're doing to fix it, right? That's a better example of that. It addresses the impact of cost, schedule, and technical performance in other areas of the program. So my task might be affecting Fred's task or Mary's task over here. How is that going to impact them? So we want to talk about those things as well. The big one, which we mentioned a little bit already, is has to have a corrective action plan. If there's no corrective action plan, why do all this stuff? It's kind of pointless, right? And there should be a plan for follow-up. So not just that you have a corrective action plan, but when you have the next meeting, the next review meeting, it just says, okay, Fred, did you take care of the action item that you had? And so when you track your action items, it says, yeah, I did that corrective action. Yes, it worked. No, it didn't work. All those things. So it produces some dialogue. So the whole purpose of the earned value is really to produce some dialogue around something that's fairly objective that you can talk about. All right, next slide here. All right, we talked a little bit about the types of variances, so let's get into that a little bit. I understand it conceptually. I don't expect anybody to remember this stuff. I don't keep it all in my head either right here. But there's rate variances, which we talked about. So it's the rate at which the earned value is earned less the actual cost rate times the actual number of hours. And so when you break that down, again, you don't have to memorize it. But if you look at, here's the BCWP dollars divided by the BCWP hours, that gives you the BCWP rate. So anyway, all that will give you a rate variance. And then the usage variance is pretty straightforward. It's just the hours that were earned minus the actual hours times the BCWP rate, which we talked about above. And so when you break all that stuff down, you can get this into, here's how many of my dollars, let's say my negative schedule variance, here's how much of that is due to the fact that I have more expensive people or more expensive whatever, and then here's how much is due that I've used more. So it helps you to pinpoint the cost, the reason for the problem. So if you need to change your labor mix, that's a very different thing than maybe I need to change the approach or deal with my budgetary issues if I'm using more of something. There's a more technical reason usually that's going on, okay? Material variances, I won't get into that. Same general idea. It's still kind of that whole cost, the usage, and rate variance type of idea. Yes, sir.
So I got a question. I'm listening to you say all this for EM.
Yeah.
And my question is, do you actually, like, when this is being implemented, on the project or program, do you just build a team of people that's going to be handling that? I'm thinking like the billing on that and the work that goes into that. I've never been a part of the EM process. Okay. So, I mean, you talked about, can you go back to the previous slide, please? Okay. you know, your corrective action plan and all that stuff, how is that all established? I mean, they can beat up your time, but you're
No,
zooming
go ahead.
through, and I just want to know, how is that all?
No, that's important. It really depends on the size of the program. So on smaller programs, you know, when I first did earn value for the first time myself, sorry, I'm getting a little bit of a dry mouth. When I first did earn value, I was the project controller. I was the only project controller, and that was like a $7.5 million program, you know, at the time. And I was able to do that with myself and a little bit of help from one other person, right? But of course, the project manager has to participate, and you know, all these people have to participate. The bigger the program is, yeah, the bigger the infrastructure gets, and that's kind of why people sometimes are a little bit, oh, I don't want to deal with earned value. It's a whole deal. The program that I was associated with for SAIC, we were a kid brother, and Boeing was big brother, is the way I used to look at it. And our piece of it was $2.7 billion. It's huge. Boeing had like $21 billion for that program at the time that didn't even exist anymore. But it was, I want to say we had about 50 people that were purely dedicated to feeding this engine right here, okay? Now that's on the billions and billions of dollars, right, what we're talking about. So absolutely there's an infrastructure, there's processes that go into this. Like I haven't talked at all and don't have time to really talk about all the processes and procedures. When you talk about having a validated earned value management system, I mean, they come in and make sure they make sure you have the infrastructure to do this stuff. I don't know about Noblest, but there's probably, you know, you get a system description document for your company, and here's all the processes. Here's how we do all those different things. And it gets approved, either approved or not approved by DCMA for use on programs. And so, yeah, it can be quite a bit, you know, depending on what you got there. Okay, great. All right, next slide. All right, this is an example. This is kind of an Excel version. There's more fancy tools and all that kind of stuff nowadays that will help you do some of those things. But this kind of gives you just the basic elements of a variance analysis template. So here's the current and cumulative figures, kind of like what we looked at before, except for we break it down to labor, materials, ODCs, all that stuff. Gives you the cost variance, schedule variance, all those different pieces of information. Go to the next slide. This is just kind of, I had to break the slide into two pieces, but it was really all one template. So I would have, here's my labor rate variance, here's my labor efficiency or my usage variance, material sub variance, ODC variance, and I tended not to break the other pieces into rate and usage as much, but it gives people an opportunity to say, here's the reason for the variance, here's the impact that this is going to have, here's the corrective action, and here's the follow-up date. So it gives people a way of having some rigor about that. And so this was used because the customer at that time said, hey, look, you know, we go through these variances, and the explanations don't make sense sometimes, and you're not giving me any real point of action, so I need to see something different, so we started using this. All right, next slide, yeah. So talk about schedule variances a little bit. The schedule variance in earned value are expressed in terms of dollars like we talked about earlier. An accomplishment variance might be a better term, but here's something to be careful of, is you can't view it in isolation. So if you remember back to your PMD study and all that kind of stuff, there's something called a critical path, right, that goes through the network, and it's the longest path in the network. If something slips on that critical path, it's going to slip the whole project out. Well, you can have very positive schedule variances in other places, but along your critical path, it's not so positive, right? So you have to be very careful of just looking at it in aggregate. A better approach would be if you could isolate your schedule variance along the critical path and say, now how's this looking? So you got to look at that in different ways. So my only point here is, be careful of saying, hey, oh, it's all wonderful, but I don't look at other measures that are saying, hey, my schedule could be in trouble for a lot of other different reasons. Okay? Next slide. All right, now we'll talk about efficiency measures. Most of you have probably already heard of CPI and SPI. The way I like to look at it is the cost performance index is saying how much am I actually getting done for every dollar spent. Mathematically, when you go through that, it is the budgeted cost of work performed divided by the actual cost of work performed. So similar to the cost variance, whereas the cost variance, you subtracted the actual cost from the BCWP. This time you're dividing it. So obviously if your denominator gets huge relative to what you got done, then you got a serious cost efficiency problem. You're not getting very much work done. You're getting 50 cents of work done for every dollar that you spend, right? For example, if it gets all the way down to 0.5, so you don't want that. Schedule performance index, same type of thing. Budget cost of work performed divided by actual cost of work performed. And, you know, positive is always, above 1 is always good. less than 1 is always not good for all of these variances. Again, when you plot it out and you look at the trend, go to the next slide, you kind of get a picture of that. Gives you a picture of what that will look like. That's kind of how you would look at it over time and say, how am I trending? Is this getting better? Is it not getting better along the way? As a matter of fact, this is from our little example that we looked at earlier when we plotted that thing out, so we look at it, okay? All right, other things that you might look at, you might not see quite as often, but they're important, is, and I probably never remember the term critical ratio, but it's CPI times SPI. Now, you gotta be a little careful about this one, because that's one of those things that kind of blend cost performance and schedule performance. It can be useful in some of the other predictive things that we're talking about, but you could have a positive CPI and a not so favorable SPI, and then you can flip them, right? And then they could mean two very different things, right? But you could get the same number. So you could get a number that's, let's say my CPI is 1.2, my SPI is 0.8, but then if I flipped it and I said that my CPI was 0.8 and my SPI was 1.2, it's just, you get the same mathematical result, right? But it's a very different situation on your project. So I would never rely on this just by itself, okay? The other index that's important is to think about having your cost performance index going forward. So not just in my past, because the CPI looks at my past, but if I wanted to look at the TCPI, that's kind of looking at my to complete amount. So that is how much of this project's budget do I have left to earn? So budget at completion minus the budget cost of work performed, divided by my target. That could either be my budget at completion or my estimate at completion minus ACWP. So it kind of tells me what cost efficiency rate do I have to get to hit either my initial budget or to hit my estimate at completion. So that's a way to kind of think about that mentally, okay? All right, now finally, I think this is our last section, is the actual estimate completion. I spent tons of my life with dealing with EACs. The EAC really gets to the heart of cost controls and why the EVM even exists, because yes, you want to have corrective actions, you want to do those things, but you also want to be able to tell somebody, hey, this is some validation of what I think this program is going to cost at the end of the day. And people make decisions on that. They make decisions, do I keep it going, do I cut it, do I need to make some major changes to turn that curve. So the EAC is the estimate at completion, is a forecast of what the total cost will be at the end of the project. Earned value can help validate estimates of future costs. So you may go through the process of what I call counting belly buttons, right? So I've got Fred, Mary, Sally, Jim, and they're going to work all throughout the end of this project, and that comes up with a certain answer. But you want to be able to validate that with some other figures, and the earned value can help validate that, which is good. EACs also have an application. This is probably what I spend a whole lot of my time with, is they have applications to revenue recognition if your company uses what's called the percentage of completion revenue recognition method. So if they do that, then there's some differences in how you do it for internal versus external purposes, but it can be very, very important to your company, and more than likely, I'm sure the controller of this company here cares about that very, very much. It can impact the future funding of programs and even be reported at congressional levels. You gotta be very careful when you do the CPR report and things that get reported to the government. You wanna make those things as truthful as you can possibly make them. Okay, next slide. All right, so the components of the EAC are basically what are my actual costs so far and what do I think is gonna expend going forward. You factor in accruals and things like that, and we can't get into the depth of that, but make sure that you're accounting for everything. You have to account for the fact that people get raises, right? They do that. You got subcontracts, materials, all those different costs, indirect expenses, a whole bunch of stuff goes into the soup that puts together this estimate of completion. You're talking about a sizable effort. Sometimes that can be a sizable effort to actually go through that, especially on a really, really big program to go through that. I won't go too much into this, but there are some differences, as I mentioned earlier, between EACs that are developed for internal purposes for the company versus external purposes, like you got non-billable versus billable expenses, and then how you might treat project reserves and those types of things. Okay? All right, two types of EACs. Is sometimes you'll call it bottoms-up or a grassroots type of estimate where we talked about this is more counting belly buttons, like we talked about. And then there's those independent, or what I call sometimes statistical or calculated EACs, and that's based on the different formulas that we have to calculate earned value. So we'll look at those real quickly here. I think we're going to kind of might be able to make here. we have these different EACs, and I won't go through each one because I see we're getting real close to the time here. But basically, they all work kind of the same way, except for this one right here, which is a little bit different. What are my actual costs? I've spent that already, and then there's different ways of estimating my go forward. This top one just says what's left of my budget that has to be earned, and then these others are saying the same thing. What's left of the budget that is yet to be earned, but I'm factoring it by either the cost performance index or the schedule performance index. So, like take this one for example. Here's my actual cost that I've spent, and then here's what sometimes you'll see a term that you don't see too often, but they call it BCWR, budgeted cost of work remaining, and it's basically here's what I haven't yet earned on my project. And then I factor that by the CPI. So if I've got a CPI that's less than 1, what's that going to do? That's going to drive that number up. And so it helps you to get a hold of that. This one's a little different. It says take my initial budget and factor it by how I'm doing in terms of my cost performance. But anyway, these all kind of give you a number of different points to validate your more detailed estimate. And on a month-to-month basis, you might report some of these things to your customer because you can't do that type of a detailed estimate that we're talking about every single month. So these are good for that as well, okay? All right, I think we did it, wow. All right, so we kind of did the whirlwind tour, and hopefully you guys got some idea of what earned value is about, and it was useful to you. If not, you got some candy, right? All right, great. Any questions? I guess we got, what, 5-6 minutes left here?
4.
We've got 4, okay. All right, oh, okay. Your hand up first, sir?
Sir, would we be able to make the slides available to the group? Or no?
That would be a Carrie Ann thing, but
Okay, great, thanks.
yeah, or you can email me. I think it's on, matter of fact, I got cards that are sitting right there. Everybody
It's
wants
also up here.
Yeah, there you go. So there you go. Just put that right there. Yeah, I'll be happy to send it to anybody who wants that. All right, there's another question. Yes, sir.
Yeah, you're going through a project, and in the process, you uncover a problem, we say facility building, and now you've got hazardous waste, something that's going to be significant.
Yeah.
How do you change the program plan, or do you? Do you just recognize that as a change, therefore?
You're getting into another topic that is a huge topic, with earned value management. It's really about change control, and you're talking about the use of reserves as well. So a lot of times you will establish a management reserve account, which is intended for those unintended consequences, but there are rules as to how you apply that to your baseline. So for example, you can't apply management reserves to something that happened in the past. Say, oops, don't nobody think about that, right? So there's a plan that says, here's how I'm going to deal with those things. So going forward. But the idea of the use of management reserve is not to cover things up to make them go away. It's to be able to have a realistic plan going forward. So it's very demoralizing to a team when you have a plan that I can never ever get a good number, right? So that's when you would take those reserves and you would allocate it, or even if it winds up being a control thing with the customer, where they actually say, hey, we're going to allocate more resources to this, and then you do a rebaselining is what it's called going forward in order to do that. But that's how you would handle that. All right. Any other questions? Anybody else want more candy? I got a lot of candy right here, and I'm trying to stay away from sugar. Okay.
Things like when you're fast tracking a project, you decide to do that, you could be changing your next couple months, you might have more resources. That would be a case.
Right. That could be a case when you do that. But again, you got to go through the change control process. So that's a whole big area where managing the performance measurement baseline. So you can't just willy-nilly do that. There's processes, baseline change requests that have to be approved. All those things go through it. Now, if you're just doing it for your small internal project, well, you can do that yourself, right? And say, okay, well, I'm just kind of reprogramming. I mean, there's different ways. There's some curves that you can kind of look at that talked about different types of baselines, whereas I'm still staying in my overall target, but I'm changing the timing and the shifting of when things happen. That's one kind of change. It's another kind of change that I'm adding or taking away budget altogether. So those are a little bit different. Yeah. Okay. Any other questions, thoughts? All right. Cool. I appreciate it, guys. All right. Take care.